I read the text message 3 times before letting my phone go dark. Across the parking lot, limousines rolled in one after another, their headlights briefly cutting through the November dusk. A string quartet played somewhere inside the music, drifting out whenever the doors opened. Warm light spilled from the ballroom windows onto the manicured gardens below. 200 guests were inside, celebrating my brother Marcus and his new bride. Every aunt, every uncle, every cousin I had grown up with. Our parents were probably smiling for photos, telling anyone who would listen how proud they were of their son. I was not inside. I had not been invited. The message had come from Marcus himself, sent an hour before the ceremony. Just a reminder, little sister. If you swing by later, wait for the scraps. We'll save you a plate. A laughing emoji followed like a soft cushion placed over something sharp. As if we both understood my role in this family and he was simply naming it out loud. I didn't reply. Another car pulled up to the valet stand. A woman in a silver dress stepped out laughing at something her husband whispered to her. They linked arms and disappeared through the entrance, swallowed by warmth and light, while I stood alone in the cold. There's a particular feeling that comes with being excluded long enough. At first it stings, then it confuses you. Eventually it becomes familiar, like an old injury that never healed properly. You stop expecting fairness. You stop being surprised. You learn to stand slightly to the side of things, ready to move if you're in the way. This wasn't the first family gathering I'd been left out of. I thought about my 30th birthday, how my mother called 2 days late because she'd been busy helping Marcus move into a new apartment. I thought about my college graduation, how my father checked his watch throughout the ceremony and left early to catch one of Marcus's games. I thought about holidays where I brought side dishes but never sat at the main table. Family photos where I stood near the edge, half out of frame, like someone forgot I was there when they pressed the shutter. Part of me wanted to be angry and part of me was. But mostly I felt worn down by the waiting, by the hoping, by all the excuses I'd made for people who never felt the need to make any for me. Inside the ballroom, the music swelled. I could picture Marcus at the center of it all, confident, charming, effortlessly admired. The golden child who could do no wrong, our parents glowing with pride. His new in-laws commented on how seamless everything felt, how polished the evening was, how impressive the whole event appeared. No one was asking where I was. And if they did, I knew exactly how my mother would answer. Oh, you know how she is. Keeps to herself. She's doing fine. I had spent my whole life being fine, learning not to need much, not to ask questions, and to step aside whenever Marcus needed the room. What none of them ever asked, what no one seemed curious about, was what I did with all those years of stepping aside. I looked up at the building across from me, the limestone facade, the tall windows, the quiet precision of a place that ran smoothly because every detail mattered. I knew that building well, better than most people inside it. I knew it in a way you only do when you've spent years paying attention before guests ever noticed them. That knowledge settled in my chest, heavy and quiet. Behind me, applause broke out. Laughter followed. Probably the first dance. I imagined Marcus spinning his bride while everyone clapped glasses, raised cameras flashing. I didn't turn around. Later that night at home, I poured a glass of wine and sat alone in my living room. The silence felt different from the cold outside. Less sharp, more honest. I scrolled past photos online, cake cutting, champagne toasts, smiling faces. My absence went unremarked. I finished my wine and set the glass down. For years, I had been the one who filled in gaps no one noticed, the one who smoothed things over, the one who made it work quietly, reliably, without needing credit or thanks. Somewhere along the way, that quiet support had turned into expectation into entitlement. Tonight made that clear. I wasn't fueled by anger, and I didn't feel the need to plead for answers. What settled over me instead was something quieter, heavier, final. That night, the decision didn't arrive in a burst of emotion. It came calmly, deliberately, like a mechanism locking into place after being strained for years. There would be no more explanations, no more quietly absorbing the cost of other people's choices, no more fixing things only noticed once they failed. I had been the invisible solution for so long that they'd forgotten what life looked like without me. They were about to remember. The day after the wedding passed without sound. 14 hours of it. By the time my phone finally lit up, I was lying in the dark staring at the ceiling. The message was from my mother. Short, neutral, carefully phrased. "Are you doing okay over there?" I didn't answer right away. I let it sit glowing softly in my hand. It wasn't a concern. There was no mention of the wedding, no acknowledgement that I hadn't been there, no question about why. It was maintenance, a check to make sure the system was still running. Eventually I typed back, "I'm fine." That word had carried me for most of my life. As long as I was fine, nothing else needed to be examined. No explanations, no discomfort, no adjustments. Being fine was my role. It hadn't started recently. It never did. I was 12 when Marcus got into an elite summer baseball camp. The cost dominated our household for weeks. Dinner conversations turned into strategy sessions, budgets, sacrifices, long-term payoff. His future was discussed like a joint investment. No one asked what I wanted. When the decision was made, my art classes disappeared quietly. My father looked at me and said gently but firmly, "You understand, right? You're the strong one." I nodded. At that age, strength meant staying quiet. The years that followed reinforced it. When Marcus went to college, I worked 2 jobs and stretched my own classes around his needs. When he needed a car, I helped cover the payments. When his first business collapsed, I stepped in so his credit wouldn't take the hit. No one ever asked directly. They didn't have to. Need arrived wrapped in silence and expectation, and I learned to answer before it was spoken. Over time, gratitude faded. Help became background noise. That morning, I opened my banking app without thinking. The story told a story no one else had bothered to read. Years of transfers, quiet bailouts, money that had altered outcomes without acknowledgement. They never asked where it came from. At family gatherings, nothing changed. I still brought side dishes, still sat away from the center, still got described as doing fine. I put the phone down and got out of bed. The day didn't wait. Meetings, calls, responsibilities that had nothing to do with family approval. But my mother's message lingered. "Are you doing okay over there? Not we missed you. Not are you hurt." Just confirmation that the backup hadn't gone offline. At work, everything ran smoothly, contracts reviewed, calls returned. My assistant asked about my weekend. I told her it had been quiet. She didn't know about the wedding. She didn't know I had a brother. That afternoon, Marcus called. His tone was easy upbeat, like nothing had happened. "You should have stopped by," he said. It was great. I told him I hadn't been invited. He laughed it off, blamed the chaos, said I could have just shown up. When I mentioned the text, he brushed it aside as a joke. Then the shift came seamless and familiar. Money was tight. The honeymoon was coming up. Could I help just for a bit? There it was. I told him I'd think about it. The silence on the line was new. "You always help," he said, not angry, confused. I repeated myself and ended the call. Afterward, my hands shook. Not from anger, not even from hurt. It felt like pressure releasing, like a structure that had held too much weight for too long finally cracking. They believed I would always be there, always absorb, always respond. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I wasn't, and the thought didn't scare me. 2 weeks passed after the wedding, and life rearranged itself as if nothing unusual had happened. Marcus and his wife were in Hawaii, their social media a parade of sunsets, ocean views, and carefully staged happiness. Every photo suggested ease, bare feet in sand drinks, sweating on white linen tables, captions about new beginnings. My parents replayed the day, like a highlight reel recounting how stunning everything had been, how impressed the in-laws were, how smoothly it all came together. No one mentioned my absence. No one wondered aloud where I had been. If normal meant selective memory, then yes, normal had returned. The interruption came on a weekday morning. My mother called before I could settle fully into my day, her voice already moving, already filling space. She talked about the weather, about how winter had arrived early this year, about how the house had always struggled with heating. I recognized the pattern immediately. Context first, sympathy next. The request is waiting patiently behind it all. I let her speak until she ran out of momentum. How much I asked. The pause that followed was brief, but it told me everything. $4,000, she said. The repair can't wait. And with everything going on, your father's pension, the wedding costs were just stretched right now. There was a time when that sentence would have triggered movement before thought. A transfer was made while she was still talking. Reassurance layered on top so she wouldn't feel uncomfortable accepting it. I would have minimized the impact, framed it as easy, manageable, nothing worth mentioning again. Instead, I stayed quiet. In the space between us, my office window reflected the city below, cars moving steadily, people carrying their own unseen burdens, each one unaware of mine. The stillness felt unfamiliar, like standing in a place I'd never allowed myself to occupy before. Why wasn't I invited to the wedding, I asked. The question didn't land cleanly. It disrupted the script. "Oh, honey," she said, a note of irritation slipping in. "Not this again. You know how chaotic things were." Details slipped. Marcus texted me to wait for scraps. He was joking. "You know how he jokes. No one asked where I was. We thought you were busy. You're always busy with work." There it was, the familiar reframing. My exclusion turned into my choice. My hurt repositioned as an inconvenience. It was a tone I had learned to recognize early, one that usually pushed me into apology. It didn't work this time. "I can't help with the furnace," I said. The silence on the other end was sharper than before. This wasn't a disappointment. It wasn't guilt. It was disorientating. The response didn't compute. "What do you mean you can't?" she asked carefully. "I mean, I won't be helping. But you always do. Maybe that's part of the problem." Her voice hardened. "Is this about the wedding? Because that would be incredibly petty." "I'm not being petty," I replied. "I'm setting a boundary." The call ended without warmth, without resolution. I sat there longer than necessary, aware that something had shifted permanently. For the first time, I had left a problem exactly where it originated. The reaction came quickly. My father called next, confused more than angry. An aunt reached out, concern wrapped in advice. Marcus called from Hawaii, disbelief echoing through the distance, telling me I was acting strange. I responded selectively, repeating the same sentence until it lost its novelty. "I can't help right now. I need time." They treated it like a malfunction, temporary, inconvenient, bound to correct itself. While they waited, my life continued uninterrupted. Work demanded focus. Vendors needed approval. Budgets required review. Spring bookings filled the calendar. I moved through my days with practiced precision, reminded daily that the structure I'd built functioned without emotional negotiation. During a site visit at the Grand Belmont, I walked through the ballroom while staff adjusted layouts for upcoming events. Everything ran smoothly. Problems were addressed quietly, efficiently, before guests would ever notice them. I remembered standing outside that same building weeks earlier, watching from the cold. The wedding planner called later to thank me for accommodating such a prominent event. She praised the family's enthusiasm and mentioned how thrilled the bride's mother had been with the space. I listened, offered polite acknowledgement, and said nothing more. Professional distance came easily. The invoice did not. 30 days after the event, the remaining balance became due. Marcus had paid the deposit, but the outstanding amount was significant. Not impossible, just inconvenient for someone accustomed to soft landings. I knew his habits well. Spending first. Confidence replacing caution. A reliance on rescue instead of planning. I reviewed the file once. I could have intervened, waived the balance, labeled it generosity instead of habit, preserved the illusion that nothing fundamental had changed. Instead, I forwarded it for processing. No notes, no adjustments, no special handling. The system did what it was designed to do, generated the invoice, scheduled delivery, marked the account overdue. The envelope would reach his house within 3 days. At that point, my family still believed I was pausing, not stopping, that I was upset, not resolved. That discomfort would eventually trigger correction. They were waiting for intervention. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't a delay, it was a decision. I shut down my computer as evening settled over the city and left the office without looking back. Somewhere across town, a letter was already moving through the system, and nothing was going to intercept it. The calls began on a Tuesday, not the usual check-ins I had learned to ignore. These were deliberate, coordinated. My phone lit up every hour with names I recognized too well. Relatives who rarely contacted me unless something was wrong or expensive. They weren't asking how I was. They were checking whether the system was back online. My mother called first. Her voice carried that familiar blend of concern and accusation, the tone she used when she wanted something, but needed to sound reasonable about it. "Your father and I have been talking," she said. "We're worried about you. This isn't like you." I leaned back in my chair and watched the city move outside my office window. What isn't like me? This distance, this coldness. She sighed softly, as if the weight of my behavior was exhausting her. "Family has always come first for you." I almost laughed. Family had always come first because I made it so, because I absorbed the impact, because I stepped in before things broke. They had mistaken my reliability for obligation, my silence for consent. "I'm fine," I said, "just busy." There was a pause, then sharper. "Too busy for your own family." "Yes." The word landed heavier than I expected. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't explained myself. But it was the first time I had ever refused to soften the truth for her comfort. She hung up shortly after, unsettled. My father called that evening. He didn't waste time on concern. He never did. He preferred authority, the calm, disappointed tone of a man used to being obeyed. "I don't know what's going on with you," he said, "but your mother is upset. Your brother is upset. This thing with the furnace has everyone worried. I know. You've always been the stable one, the one we could count on." His voice hardened slightly. "Don't let some misunderstanding ruin that." "What misunderstanding?" "The wedding," he said, impatient now. "Marcus didn't mean anything by that text. You know how he jokes. He told me to wait for scraps, a beat, then dismissal. You're taking it too personally, and you're asking me to pretend it didn't happen. You're really going to let a joke cause this much damage?" I took a slow breath. "No, I'm letting the family exist without me fixing everything. If that damages it, maybe it wasn't as strong as you thought." Silence followed. I could hear him recalibrating, searching for a strategy that would work on the daughter who had never pushed back before. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "An apology. I want to be treated like I matter," I said. "I want to be invited to family events. I want someone to ask how I'm doing without it leading to a financial conversation." "That's not fair," he snapped. "We don't treat you like that. When was the last time you asked about my work?" No answer. "My health?" Nothing. "When was the last time you called just to talk?" The silence stretched long enough to become an answer. "I'm not angry," I said quietly. "I'm just tired. I've been carrying this family for years, and none of you noticed because it was convenient not to." He ended the call saying he needed time to think. Marcus didn't wait that long. He called from Hawaii, his voice sharp and defensive, sunburned confidence barely masking irritation. "What is your problem?" he demanded. "Mom and Dad think you're having some kind of breakdown." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're acting weird. You won't help with the furnace. You're being cold to everyone. This isn't you. Maybe you don't know me as well as you think." He scoffed. "I know you're my sister. I know we've always had each other's backs." "Have we?" I asked. "When have you had mine?" There it was. The hesitation. The scramble. "I was always there for you," he said finally. "Name one time." Silence. Then irritation. "This is ridiculous. I'm not going to defend myself. I don't know what got into you, but you need to stop this. The family needs you." "No," I said calmly. "The family needs my money. That's different." I ended the call. Over the next few days, the pattern became impossible to ignore. An aunt called to check in, then pivoted to asking whether I'd reconsider helping with a short-term expense. A cousin texted something cheerful, followed by a subtle hint about bills piling up. Every interaction came with an expectation attached. So I started documenting. Not obsessively, methodically. Dates, names, what was said, what wasn't. I didn't need proof for them, I needed it for myself. To confirm that I hadn't imagined the imbalance, that I hadn't exaggerated the silence where care should have been. The evidence was overwhelming. In that family, I was neither daughter nor sister. I was infrastructure useful, unnoticed, assumed to be permanent. And like all infrastructure, my presence only mattered once it was gone. That night, there was no confrontation, no dramatic meeting, no demand for recognition or accountability. I withdrew instead. The loans stopped. The gifts quietly ended. So did the rescues that had kept everything functioning while my absence went unremarked. I remained polite, civil, available only on my own terms. They mistook the silence for a phase, assumed I would cool down, believed I would eventually return to my assigned place once the discomfort passed. They were mistaken. They just hadn't felt the consequences yet. January arrived without fanfare, dragging ice storms and rolling blackouts behind it. The kind of winter that didn't just inconvenience people, but exposed weaknesses, old pipes, fragile systems, assumptions that only worked when conditions were mild. Streets disappeared under layers of gray slush. The city moved slower, conserving heat, conserving energy, bracing itself. I moved through my days with practiced precision. Mornings began at the office. Afternoons were spent on-site walking through half-finished spaces, listening to contractors debate marble cuts and lighting temperatures details most guests would never consciously notice, but would feel. The Grand Belmont was mid-renovation. Nothing flashy, no expansions, just refinement. Adjustments so subtle they bordered on invisible. Quiet work. Structural work. What I didn't do was reach out to my family. No New Year messages, no just checking in, no instinctive texts asking how they were holding up after the holidays. I didn't ask about the furnace. I didn't ask about the honeymoon. I didn't ask how married life was unfolding for Marcus. For the first time in my adult life, I stopped being the one who initiated. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was revealing. One day passed, then another, then a full week. Nothing arrived in return. No missed calls, no worried messages, no casual updates disguised as care. The absence didn't escalate, it simply remained complete, uninterrupted. I had always believed I was choosing to be quiet when I stepped back. The truth was harsher. If I didn't pull the thread, there was nothing holding the fabric together. 2 weeks in, the realization settled with the dull certainty of a diagnosis you'd suspected but hoped to avoid. My place in the family had never been reciprocal. It wasn't emotional, it was architectural. I was reinforcement, not a relationship. Remove reinforcement and structures don't collapse immediately. They drift, they creak, they separate at the seams. Then the invoices began to surface. Weddings are expensive by design. Marcus and his wife hadn't economized. Premium catering, imported florals, custom photography packages. Every choice reflected confidence, the kind that treats numbers as theoretical until they aren't. All of it flowed through our preferred vendors. All of it ran on standard net 30 terms. By mid-January, those terms expired. My accounts receivable team followed protocol exactly as trained: courteous emails, neutral language, no judgment, no commentary, just a procedure. I gave them a single directive: handle it like any other overdue account, no exceptions, no discretion, no shortcuts. The first call from my mother came on a Thursday afternoon. Her voice was measured carefully, neutral, the tone she used when she didn't yet know what leverage she had. She didn't mention money at first. She asked whether I'd spoken to Marcus. I told her I hadn't. There was a pause. Then she added almost casually that he seemed stressed, that wedding costs had exceeded expectations, that adjusting to married life took time, that she and my father were worried. I listened. I offered sympathetic noises. I didn't offer relief. When the call ended, I stayed seated, hands folded, staring through the glass wall of my office. For years, my body had been conditioned to respond automatically to distress, hear tension, provide solutions. The absence of that response felt unnatural, like holding a breath too long. Guilt arrived on schedule. But beneath it was something heavier: gravity. I began to understand that my help had never strengthened them. It had insulated them. I hadn't been a safety net. I'd been a blindfold. By the end of the month, the venue balance itself triggered escalation. My team issued a formal notice, the kind that referenced timelines and credit reporting. I approved it without comment. Marcus called that night. He skipped pleasantries entirely. "They're threatening collections," he said, his voice tight. "Do you know what that does to credit? I can imagine." "This is insane. The venue's being aggressive. They're enforcing the contract." "You work in this world," he snapped. "You must know someone. Call them. Talk to whoever's in charge." That was the moment I understood something clearly. Marcus had never been curious about how I knew what I knew, or why I navigated spaces he found intimidating with ease. He didn't care about structure, only access. "I can't help with that," I said. A pause. Then disbelief. "You won't, I won't. You've changed." "Yes." I ended the call and turned off my phone. My father called the next day. He approached it differently. Calm, authoritative disappointment carefully wrapped in reason. He said the venue was being unreasonable. He said Marcus was under pressure. He said family doesn't let family drown. I told him evenly that I wasn't pushing anyone underwater. I was simply no longer holding them above the surface. The silence that followed was long. Then he asked, "When did you become like this?" "I didn't," I said. "I just stopped compensating." By February, the tension had spread. Marcus and his wife were arguing. My parents were scrambling. The money they assumed was accessible. The invisible buffer that had always absorbed shock was gone. And still they weren't panicking, because they believed they understood the problem. The wedding planner reached out that week, looping me into a clarification thread. Her tone was professional, precise. "The owner is very particular about compliance," she wrote. "Once notices are issued, there's no discretionary override." My mother latched onto the phrase immediately. The owner. That explained everything. In their minds, the picture was resolved neatly. I wasn't the authority. I was adjacent, a manager, an insider, someone with proximity, not power. It preserved their worldview without forcing a reckoning. They stopped calling me angry. They started calling me hopeful. "You must be high up," my mother said gently one evening. "Not the owner, of course, but it's important." Marcus echoed it days later, frustration softened by relief. "So you're not in charge. You're just involved. Just involved." They relaxed, convinced they'd found the boundary of my influence, confident they finally knew where my reach ended. I didn't correct them, because for the first time they weren't waiting for me to save them. They were waiting for someone else to fail. And I let them wait. By the end of February, the system they had relied on for years was exposed. Bills accumulated, credit tightened. Conversations shifted in tone, less confident, more urgent. I watched it happen without intervening, not detached, just no longer embedded. They still believed this was temporary, that I was withholding help, not removing it, that pressure would eventually trigger a correction. They were waiting, and for the first time I let the waiting do the work. The demand for a family meeting arrived in early February. My mother didn't ask. She informed me, "We need to talk. All of us. This weekend, your father insists." The phrasing was familiar, a decision already made wrapped in concern, so it couldn't be refused without consequence. I agreed, not out of obligation, but curiosity. I wanted to see how they planned to explain what was happening, what version of reality they needed me to accept so everything could return to normal. We met at my parents' house around the same dining table where rules had always existed without being spoken. Marcus sat rigid beside his wife, jaw-tight, foot-tapping. My parents positioned themselves together at the head, unified by something that looked like worry, but felt more like authority. I took the chair at the end, where I always sat. My father spoke first. "We're worried about you." "I'm fine, you're not." He leaned forward. "You've been distant, cold. You're not acting like part of this family." I met his eyes. "What does acting like part of this family look like?" He hesitated, being willing to help when things get hard. "I've been helping for 15 years, I said evenly. No one seemed concerned then. My mother stepped in quickly, voice gentler but edged with impatience. "Honey, we've always appreciated you. We just don't understand what's going on." "Is this about the wedding?" "It's about everything," I replied. "The wedding just made it visible. Visible how that I only exist here when I'm useful, when I'm fixing something, paying for something, making things easier for everyone else." Marcus scoffed. "That's not true. We love you." I turned to him slowly. "When was the last time you called me just to talk?" He opened his mouth. I closed it. "When was the last time any of you asked about my life without needing something?" The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was decisive. My father shifted, recalibrating. Whatever feelings you're having, we can address them later. Right now, there's a practical issue. The venue is escalating. Marcus's credit is at risk. His marriage is under pressure. This is a crisis. I helped through plenty of crises, I said. They just didn't get labeled that way when I was the one absorbing them. So you're going to let your brother suffer because you're upset, my mother asked. I'm going to let him experience the outcome of decisions he made without me, I replied. That isn't punishment. That's the consequence. Marcus slammed his palm against the table. You're enjoying this. You've always been jealous of me. Now you finally have leverage and you're using it. I didn't raise my voice. I was never jealous of you. Then why won't you help? Because the help already happened. For years. You just stopped noticing. His wife looked between us, confusion flickering across her face. What help? I met her gaze. Ask him how the numbers worked when they didn't add up. Marcus stared down at the table. The room shifted not dramatically, but perceptibly. My mother's eyes filled with tears. My father looked suddenly tired, as if something he'd been leaning on had quietly moved. You should have told us, my mother whispered. Would it have mattered? I asked. If anyone had wanted to know, they would have asked. No one answered. I stood smoothing my coat. I'm not angry. I'm just done pretending everything is fine while I disappear. You can handle the wedding bills. You can handle everything else too. I didn't wait for permission. Outside, the cold air felt sharp and clarifying. Behind me, voices rose, overlapping explanations. Frustration. Denial. For the first time, I didn't stay to manage it. By the time I reached home, I understood what they didn't. Nothing had been taken from them. I had simply stopped holding the system together, and it was already starting to wobble. And they still believed they understood where my limits were. March arrived without mercy. The storms came first, sheets of rain that rattled windows, whined, that howled through the streets, cold, that lingered longer than it should have. The city felt tight, compressed, as if everything was being squeezed inward. People stayed home, tempers shortened, bills piled up quietly the way they always do when winter refuses to let go. I stayed busy. Work gave me structure when everything else went silent. Contracts crossed my desk. Site visits filled my afternoons. Expansion plans moved forward indifferent to my family's unraveling. My calendar stayed full, my days orderly. There was comfort in that, knowing something in my life still responded predictably when I showed up. At home, the quiet was different. Not peaceful, not resolved. It was the kind of silence that stretches too long, the kind that feels less like calm and more like pressure, building behind a closed door. No calls, no texts, no attempts at small talk disguised as concern. Just absence. They were waiting. I knew that much. Waiting for me to blink. Waiting for the moment I would step back in and restore balance. Waiting for the system they depended on to restart itself. Bits of information reached me anyway. An aunt mentioned Marcus had been stressed. A cousin hinted that the wedding bills hadn't been settled. Someone else let slip that collections had been mentioned quietly at first, then more urgently. Marcus's credit score had taken a hit. His in-laws, once dazzled by the spectacle of the wedding, were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about finances they'd assumed were solid. My parents were struggling too. The furnace repair had gone on a credit card. Other expenses were stacking up, the mundane ones they'd never worried about before: groceries, insurance, car maintenance, things that used to disappear quietly because someone else had always absorbed the shock, that someone was gone. I listened when I heard these things. I nodded when people talked around the truth. I felt the old instinct flare. You could fix this. You could end this spiral with one call. And then I did nothing. Letting go was not passive. It was active restraint. Every part of me had been trained to intervene at the first sign of trouble. I was conditioned to read distress like a language, to translate discomfort into action. Silence had always been my cue to step in, not step back. Now I stayed still. I learned how loud absence could be. The guilt came in waves. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but persistent. A low hum beneath everything else. I questioned myself in quiet moments. Is this cruelty? Is this punishment? Is this really necessary? But every time doubt surfaced, something else answered it. Memory. Years of smoothing things over, years of being the backup plan no one acknowledged, years of solving problems before they were even labeled as problems. I hadn't created their dependence, but I had sustained it. Stopping didn't make me cruel, it made me honest. By the end of March, the situation had become impossible to ignore. Marcus and his wife were arguing openly about money, not whispers anymore. Full conversations that ended abruptly when other people entered the room. The shine of newlywed optimism was wearing thin, replaced by the stress of numbers that didn't add up. My parents tried to help him. They couldn't. For the first time, they were confronting a reality they'd never examined closely. Their finances only worked because I had been quietly reinforcing them. Without that reinforcement, everything felt fragile. They still believed I would return, that this was temporary. Early April brought the request I'd been expecting. Marcus asked to meet. No anger this time, no entitlement, just a short message asking if we could talk somewhere neutral. I agreed, more curious than cautious. I wanted to see who he was without the safety net beneath him. We met at a small cafe downtown. It was quiet, the kind of place where conversations stay low and private by default. Marcus looked different, older, not just tired, worn. The confidence he usually carried like armor was thinner, now cracked in places he hadn't bothered to repair. He didn't start with accusations. "They're saying the venue is being aggressive," he said after we sat down. His voice was careful, controlled, unreasonable. "They won't budge." I stirred my coffee once, watching the surface ripple. "They're not being aggressive." He frowned. "Then what are they doing?" I looked up. "They're following instructions." Mine. The words didn't land all at once. At first he just stared at me, confused, processing. Then his expression shifted subtly, but unmistakably, as the implication found its way through his assumptions. "What do you mean? Yours?" he asked. I didn't rush to explain. I didn't clarify. Didn't soften the edges or fill the silence. I let the meaning sit between us, heavy and unresolved. Color drained from his face slowly, as if understanding was something his body resisted before his mind caught up. He leaned back, gripping his cup too tightly, knuckles pale. "You're saying," he started, then stopped. "I'm saying you signed the contract," I replied. Calm, even, and the terms are being enforced. The space between us felt suddenly enormous. He glanced around the cafe as if expecting someone to interrupt, to laugh, to correct me. No one did. The world kept moving. Cups clinked. A barista called out an order. "You knew," he said finally. Not angry, not accusing, just stunned. Yes, that was it. No speeches, no explanations, no victory lap. The truth didn't need embellishment. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the table, at the place where his certainty used to be. I could almost see the mental recalibration happening, the past being reinterpreted through a new lens. Old interactions suddenly weighted differently. When I stood to leave, he didn't stop me. He didn't argue, didn't demand anything. He just watched me go, eyes fixed on the gap I left behind. Outside, the air had warmed. Spring was finally asserting itself, sunlight cutting through clouds, the city shaking off winter in small, deliberate ways. I walked to my car feeling lighter than I had in months, not triumphant, not vindicated, relieved, because for the first time I wasn't carrying something that never belonged to me in the first place. The support had stopped, and everything was finally being seen for what it was. April arrived without ceremony. No storms, no sharp turns, just longer days and gentler light, the city easing into spring, while my family remained suspended over unstable ground. The chaos hadn't exploded, it had settled. Quiet, persistent, unavoidable. They couldn't fix this without me. That realization was what finally brought my mother to my office. She arrived unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. I saw her through the glass walls of the lobby, standing near the water feature we'd installed the year before. She looked smaller there, uncertain in a space built for confidence. Her hands gripped her purse too tightly. She glanced between the reception desk and the elevators, unsure which direction belonged to her. I didn't move at first. I watched her the way you watch someone hesitate at the edge of unfamiliar ground. At home, she was decisive, especially where Marcus was concerned. Here, stripped of context and authority, she looked lost. The lobby moved around her with quiet precision. Staff passed by. Phones rang softly. Elevators chimed. The scent of fresh lilies drifted through the air. Every detail had been chosen deliberately. It was a world I had built without her noticing. When I stepped into view, relief crossed her face so quickly it almost hurt to see. I didn't hug her. I didn't ask why she hadn't called. I nodded and led her down the corridor to my office. The door closed behind us. She didn't sit right away. Instead, she walked to the windows, staring out at the skyline as if trying to place herself inside it. Her gaze drifted to the shelves, awards-framed photos, architectural models aligned with care. "This is yours?" she asked. "Yes." "All of it." Her voice wavered. "The Grand Belmont." "The others I own the parent company," I said. "This is where we manage everything." She sat down slowly, like her legs had reached a limit before her mind had. Her eyes kept moving, cataloging, comparing. "I didn't know," she said, not as an accusation, as a confession. "You didn't ask," I replied. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. She flinched anyway. For a moment she looked like she might defend herself, reach for the familiar explanations. "We were busy. We trusted you. You never needed anything." The shape of those excuses hovered between us. Then she didn't say anything. She started to cry, not loudly, not dramatically, just the steady release of something held together for too long. "We failed you," she said. The words landed heavily. I had imagined this moment before her apology, my vindication. In those versions, I stood taller, harder, untouched. Sitting across from her now, watching her shoulders shake, I felt none of that. I felt grief. "Yes," I said, "you did." She nodded, breathing uneven. "I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if a lifetime of being overlooked can be undone. But I need you to know. I see it now. I see what we did." She wiped her eyes. "We treated Marcus like he was made of gold, and you like you were made of iron. We assumed iron wouldn't break. I was told I had to be the strong one," I said. "You were," she replied, "but you shouldn't have had to be. We should have protected you too." The honesty unsettled me. It dismantled the defenses I had built against excuses, against denial. I let the silence stretch. She looked older than I remembered. Regret had settled into her face, deep and unflattering. For the first time, I understood something clearly. She hadn't been cruel. She had been comfortable. And I had made that comfort possible by never asking for space. I'm not ready to forgive everything I said. I may never be. But I'm willing to try something different. A relationship where I'm not invisible. She nodded immediately. "That's fair. There's one more thing," I said. "The money stops. All of it. I'm not supporting the family financially anymore. I'm not fixing Marcus's debt." She didn't argue. She didn't plead. "I know," she said. "Marcus told me." I watched her carefully. This was the moment I used to step in, reassure, soften. "Does knowing change anything?" I asked. She thought for a long time. "It makes me proud," she said finally, "and ashamed." We talked for over an hour after that, about her health, about my work, about memories we had never said out loud. Nothing was repaired, nothing was erased, but it was real. When she stood to leave, she hugged me, really hugged me. Something tight and long-held loosened in my chest. That night driving home, I understood it clearly. This hadn't been a favor. It was a boundary. And for the first time, it held. The industry conference in May was supposed to be forgettable. It was the kind of event I had attended for years, regional, predictable, useful, mostly for maintaining relationships rather than creating new ones. Venue owners compared notes on staffing challenges. Event planners exchanged vendor recommendations. Everyone wore the same polite smiles and said the same careful things. I had always kept a low profile at these gatherings. I showed up, listened more than I spoke, and left early. Visibility had never been my goal. Stability was. This year, that strategy failed. A month before the conference, my operations director forwarded me an email from the organizing committee. I had been nominated for an award recognizing excellence in venue management, something about innovation, growth, and sustained quality across multiple properties. I declined. At least I tried to. I told them I was unavailable, that I didn't like public recognition, that someone else on my team would be a better representative. All true, none accepted. My team pushed back harder than the organizers did. They reminded me that this wasn't about my comfort. It was about credibility, about signaling to clients, partners, and staff that the work we'd done quietly for years mattered. Eventually, I agreed. I chose a simple black dress and arrived late, intending to sit near the back and leave as soon as my obligation was fulfilled. I had no intention of making a night of it. The ballroom was larger than I expected. 300 people, maybe more, round tables filled with industry professionals, soft lighting a stage dressed for ceremony rather than networking. The MC gave a long speech about creating spaces where life milestones happened, about responsibility, about trust. Then he said my name. Walking to the stage felt unreal. Applause rose, not polite, not obligatory, but warm. I saw faces I recognized only vaguely. People I had worked with indirectly for years now, looking at me with something like acknowledgement. I accepted the award and spoke briefly. I thanked my team. I thanked our staff. I thanked the clients who trusted us with moments they could never redo. I did not mention family. I did not mention sacrifice. I did not explain myself. Afterward, I couldn't leave. People stopped me constantly. Venue owners I had quietly outperformed wanted advice. Planners I'd worked with once asked about availability months in advance. A reporter from an industry publication requested an interview. By the end of the evening, my name had been photographed, tagged, shared. Industry newsletters picked it up. Social media did what it always does, connected dots. I had spent years keeping separate. It didn't take long for that information to reach my family. My aunt called first, breathless. "You were on the news." Something hospitality related. I had no idea you were such a big deal. I minimized it instinctively. Old habits. But there was no undoing it. Within days, everyone knew. The reactions were uneven. Some relatives were offended, deeply unsettled by the idea that I had been capable of enforcing a contract against my own brother. They framed it as coldness, as ambition unchecked by loyalty. Others were impressed, quietly so. These were the ones who had always sensed the imbalance, but never challenged it. A few reached out privately to say they understood, that they had noticed how differently Marcus was treated, that they had wondered occasionally why I was always present, but never centered. Family gatherings shifted. I attended a couple cautiously. Conversations paused when I entered the rooms. People asked questions they had never bothered to ask before about my work, my travel, my plans. The attention was awkward, unpracticed, like a language learned too late. I remained polite, cordial, distant. This new visibility did not feel like victory. It felt like exposure. Marcus and I did not speak for most of the summer. Our only communication was transactional payment schedules, deadlines, confirmations. Nothing personal, nothing reflective. Then Jessica reached out. She asked to meet for coffee, her message careful and direct. When we sat down, she didn't waste time. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for the wedding, for not asking questions, for believing what I was told instead of wondering why something didn't feel right." "You didn't know," I replied. "I should have wanted to know," she said. "I'm learning things now, about Marcus, about how much of our life was curated." She looked tired, not dramatic, just worn down by the slow erosion of certainty. "I don't know what that means yet," she continued, "whether it changes anything. But I need you to hear that I see it now." I believed her. We talked for a while, not about money, not about blame, about disorientation, about realizing you married a story instead of a person. Before we left, she said something that stayed with me. "He talks about you differently now, like he's recalibrating." "Respect that arrives late isn't the same thing," I said. "No," she agreed. "But it's still a shift." That summer, my business continued to grow. New partnerships formed. Expansion plans solidified. Opportunities arrived without fanfare, without confrontation. The work spoke for itself. At the same time, my family was adjusting to a new reality, one where my presence was no longer assumed and my absence had weight. I didn't celebrate that. I simply noticed it. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it expands quietly, reshaping the room while you're still standing in the same place. And for the first time, the world was finally adjusting to me, not the other way around. What surprised me most was how little effort it required. For years, I had believed visibility demanded performance assertion, explanation, correction. Standing in that ballroom watching people approach me with interest that had nothing to do with obligation, I realized how wrong I had been. Authority didn't need to announce itself. It simply needed to be recognized. Emails followed in the weeks after the conference. Not urgent, not pleading, just direct. Invitations to collaborate, requests for consultation, quiet inquiries about acquisitions that hadn't yet been listed publicly. People spoke to me differently now, less tentative, more precise. They assumed competence instead of asking for proof. I answered selectively. Not because I was withholding, but because I could. That distinction mattered. At work, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Staff deferred without flinching. Decisions moved faster. When I spoke in meetings, the room stayed with me. I hadn't changed how I led, but the space around me had recalibrated. What used to require reinforcement is now held on its own. At home, the contrast was sharper. Family interactions felt staged at first, overcorrected politeness, sudden curiosity that arrived without rhythm. People asked questions they didn't yet know how to sustain. Compliments landed awkwardly, as if they were testing unfamiliar language. I didn't fill the gaps. I let silence do what it does best, reveal intent. Marcus stayed distant, not hostile, contained. Updates came through formal channels only. Payment confirmations, timeline adjustments, neutral language that avoided eye contact even on paper. It was easier for him to engage with the system than with the person who had designed it. I understood that. Jessica's call changed something, though. After we met, she texted once more, not to continue the conversation, but to thank me for not weaponizing clarity. I didn't reply right away. When I did, I kept it brief. Some understanding doesn't need elaboration to hold. Late one evening, weeks later, I stood in my apartment watching the city settle into night. Lights blinked on one by one, movement slowed, patterns emerged. For the first time, I wasn't managing proximity. I wasn't adjusting myself to remain palatable, useful, available. The world wasn't leaning on me, and I wasn't bracing for impact. Expansion, I realized, didn't always look like growth. Sometimes it looked like space, and I finally had enough of it to breathe. The envelope arrived on a Thursday. It came with the rest of the mail tucked between grocery flyers and a reminder from the electric company. There was no courier or signature to suggest it mattered. Just a clean white rectangle, heavier than it looked, stamped with a return address he recognized only vaguely. My company's name. Marcus didn't open it right away. It sat on the kitchen counter while he kicked off his shoes, loosened his tie, and poured a glass of water. He had trained himself not to react too quickly to anything financial. Panic, he believed, was for people who didn't know how to manage optics. When he finally slid a finger under the flap, the paper inside didn't fight him. The invoice was neatly formatted. There were no dramatics or explanations, only numbers arranged with ruthless clarity. Principal, late fees, interest, dates, terms. His eyes skimmed once, then stopped. The total landed like a physical blow. Not because it was unfamiliar, he had seen large numbers before, but because this one had nowhere to go. No sponsor, no fallback. No quiet transfer waiting in the background to make it disappear. A smaller card slipped free and landed on the counter. Plain stock, handwritten, 5 words. Thank you for your business. He sat down slowly, the way people do when they realize their legs won't support them. The house was quiet. Jessica wasn't home yet. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. Marcus read the invoice again, this time more carefully, as if a different interpretation might reveal itself if he stared long enough. It didn't. He grabbed his phone. The call went through on the second ring. "This is from you." His voice was tight, already fraying. "From my company," I said. "Yes." Silence crackled on the line, the sound of something internal collapsing. "You own the venue," he said slowly. "Not a question. Not yet." "I told you. You said something." "I thought you meant—" "I don't know what I thought." His breath hitched. "You own it." "Yes." The word landed cleanly. No emphasis, no apology. "This bill," he continued louder now, urgency bleeding through. "Is this real? As real as the contract you signed?" He swore under his breath. I heard movement papers shuffling, a chair scraping back. "I can't pay this," he said. "Not like this. That's between you and accounts receivable." A beat. "Collections." His voice cracked on the word. "You're actually letting it go to collections. I'm not stopping the process." "This is insane," he snapped. "You could fix this in one call." I didn't answer right away, not to make a point, simply because there was nothing to add. "So this is revenge," he said. "You're punishing me." "No." The word wasn't sharp. It didn't need to be. "This is business," I continued. "The staff were paid, the vendors were paid, the space was used, the bill exists whether we're related or not." "You're my sister," he shot back, "and I wasn't invited to your wedding." That stopped him. I could hear his breathing again, faster now, uneven. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "Mom's going to lose it." She did. The call came an hour later. Her voice was high-strained, already wrapped in accusation before she reached the point. "Marcus just called us," she said. "He's beside himself. There must be some mistake." "There isn't. You didn't have to do it this way." "I didn't do anything," I replied. "The invoice was issued." "You could have handled it quietly," she insisted. "Families don't blindside each other like this." I said nothing. "You're really going to let this ruin him," she pressed. "His marriage is already under strain. The in-laws are asking questions. This is going to follow him. That's how debt works." She inhaled sharply, offended by the neutrality of my tone. "This isn't you," she said. "You're being cruel. I'm being consistent." The word hung between us, unfamiliar and unwelcome. My father called next. He tried to reason first, then disappointment, then authority. "This has gone far enough," he said. "You've made your point." "I didn't make a point." "You embarrassed your brother," he snapped. "You embarrassed this family. I didn't send the bill to anyone but the address on the contract." He exhaled, frustrated. "What do you want?" The question had weight. Expectation. Nothing I said. That was what finally rattled him. The house phone went quiet for 2 days after that. News filtered in through other channels. Jessica's parents were furious. Not loud, controlled. They asked for documentation, for timelines, for explanations Marcus couldn't provide. The version of his life he had sold them no longer matched the paperwork. A meeting happened without me. Another argument followed. My parents discussed taking out a loan. The bank declined. Their numbers didn't stretch the way they thought they did. They were seeing the shape of their finances clearly for the first time in years. At work, none of this registered. Spring bookings filled the calendar. The Grand Belmont hosted another wedding that weekend. Different couple, different music, same flawless execution. I walked the floor during teardown, checking details, approving next steps. The system worked. The invoice remained unpaid. Formal notices went out. Dates were logged. The process continued unchanged. Then the phone rang again. It was Marcus. This time he didn't bother trying to sound controlled. "They're saying my credit's already flagged," he said, words tumbling over each other. "Jessica's parents want a meeting. They think I lied. They're talking about conditions. Oversight." He stopped, breath hitching. "I need you to stop this," he said. "Not angry now. Afraid. Please, just tell them to pause." I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the city. Traffic moved the way it always did. People solved their own problems, unaware of mine. "I can't," I said. His voice rose, panic finally breaking through completely. "You don't understand. This is everything. This is my life." I let the silence stretch. Then calmly, evenly, I understand exactly what it is. He made a sound, then not a word, something raw, uncontained. The call dropped a second later. Whether he hung up or his hand slipped, I didn't know. I didn't call back. The envelope had done its job, and the system was already in motion. The fallout didn't arrive in flames. There was no shouting match, no dramatic family rupture, no single moment where everything exploded. Instead, it cooled, slowly, quietly, uncomfortably. By the time the family gathered for Sunday brunch at my aunt's house in July, the temperature had dropped just enough for everyone to feel it. Conversations were softer. Movements are more careful, smiles slower to form. Something fundamental had shifted, even if no one wanted to name it. For as long as I could remember, these gatherings followed an unspoken hierarchy. Marcus was the center of gravity. He took the head of the table by default, leaning back comfortably, narrating his life like a highlight reel. Careers, wins, complaints, plans. Everyone else orbited him, responding, laughing, nodding on cue. I had always existed on the perimeter, refilling coffee, passing napkins, listening more than speaking. My role was functional, not central, useful, not celebrated. That day, the pattern broke. The moment I stepped onto the patio, the conversation didn't just pause, it collapsed. Forks hovered midair, someone cleared their throat, a laugh died unfinished. My aunt stood up immediately. "Sarah," she said, her voice carrying a nervous brightness I'd never heard before. "You're here. Come sit. I saved you a chair in the shade." She didn't gesture toward the folding chair at the far end of the table, the one I usually occupied. Instead, she led me to a padded armchair positioned beside my father. Prime seating. I felt the shift ripple outward as I sat down. Marcus was already there. He didn't look up. His attention was fixed on a bowl of fruit in front of him, jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jumping near his temple. Across from him, Jessica sat unnaturally still, her posture perfect, her eyes flicking between us like she was watching a match she hadn't agreed to attend. The meal unfolded in fragments. Polite questions, over-careful laughter, long pauses that no one rushed to fill. My cousin's people, who usually treated me like background noise, unless they needed tech help or career advice, kept glancing in my direction, curiosity written openly across their faces. Finally, Sarah, my younger cousin, broke the tension. So she said cautiously, "The Grand Belmont." My friend tried to book it for her engagement party. They said it's full through next year. You really manage all that. I met her eyes. I own the parent company. We operate 12 properties across the state. The silence that followed was dense enough to press against my ears. My mother stared down at her plate, pushing lettuce around without eating. My father cleared his throat, the sound unusually loud in the stillness. "That's good work," he said, his voice rougher than usual. He didn't look at Marcus. "Hard work. You should have told us you were doing so well." I didn't hesitate. "I would have," I said evenly. If anyone had ever asked what I did when I wasn't bailing this family out, Marcus's fork clattered sharply against his plate. "So that's what this is. Now," he snapped. "We're just going to sit here and talk about how Sarah's the savior while I'm being squeezed for every cent I don't have." I met his gaze calmly. "Nobody called me a savior," I said. "I'm a businesswoman who stopped giving away her product for free." Jessica spoke before he could respond. Her voice was quiet, but it cut cleanly through the space. "She's right, Marcus. We wouldn't be here if you hadn't tried to buy a lifestyle your sister was actually living." Marcus flushed red. His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in his life, he had no audience. No one rushed to defend him. No one softened the moment. No one laughed it off. The golden child's shine hadn't faded, it had peeled. The rest of brunch passed in small, telling moments. My aunt asked for my opinion on an investment property she was considering. My father listened, really listened when I talked about expansion plans. My mother asked about my work schedule instead of my availability. The hierarchy had quietly inverted. I wasn't the invisible sister anymore. I wasn't the backup plan. I wasn't the family's unspoken safety net. I was the axis. When it was time to leave, I noticed Marcus standing alone by his car. A modest sedan, now the luxury vehicle long gone sold to cover part of the debt. He looked smaller than I remembered, not diminished, just exposed. I didn't approach him. I didn't need to. The truth had already done what confrontation never could. As I drove away, I realized something important. Power doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It's felt when the room rearranges itself around you, when chairs move voices lower, and the people who once overlooked you start choosing their words carefully. That was the moment I knew. The shift wasn't temporary. It was permanent. The drive home felt longer than usual, not because traffic was heavy, but because there was nothing left to outrun. The adrenaline that had carried me through the afternoon drained away, leaving behind something steadier. Not relief, not satisfied. Recognition. I had always imagined power as something loud, asserted, defended, claimed in real time. What I felt now was quieter than that. It didn't need reinforcement. It didn't require witnesses. It simply existed. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the windshield. The same face, the same posture. Nothing about me looked different, and yet the rules governing that face had changed. I realized then that this was the first family gathering I would not replay, later searching for mistakes. The first time I would not rehearse conversations in my head, wondering what I should have said differently. There was nothing to correct, nothing to clarify. The shift had already taken hold without my participation. Whatever came next, awkward dinners, tentative calls, slow recalibrations would unfold without me managing the outcome. I would not need to prepare defenses or soften edges. They would learn gradually how to meet me where I stood. And if they didn't, that too would be information. When I pulled into my driveway, the house was dark and quiet. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, aware of something new settling into place. For the first time, my life felt aligned, not balanced aligned, and I knew with an unexpected calm that nothing in that room would ever return to its previous shape. Fall arrived without announcement. Leaves gathered along sidewalks. Mornings cooled. The year began to fold inward slower, now more deliberate. The wedding venue debt was nearly paid. My family had settled into new rhythms, not healed, not restored, but no longer bleeding. Functional, honest, less performative. One Saturday morning, I sat at my desk reviewing the year's numbers. Record revenue, record bookings, expansion ahead of schedule. My team moved with confidence, building without panic. 15 years of quiet work had compounded into something solid, something that didn't require my constant intervention to survive. But the numbers weren't what stayed with me. What stayed with me was the parking lot outside Marcus's wedding, the glow from the ballroom, music leaking into the cold. His text told me to wait for scraps. I remembered how small I had felt, how easily dismissed, how invisible. I don't feel small anymore. The distance between that parking lot and this office hadn't been crossed by success alone. It had been crossed through discomfort, through boundaries that looked like betrayal, through restraint mistaken for cruelty by people used to my sacrifice. I had watched my family struggle with consequences I once absorbed without comment. None of it had been easy. All of it had been necessary. I thought about my mother sitting across from me in this very room, her tears, her quiet admission that they had failed me, about my father's pride offered late, but honestly, about Marcus slowly shedding entitlement, learning that confidence and assumption were not currencies that always cleared. The hardest truth was this: none of them were villains. They were ordinary people repeating patterns they had never questioned because I made it possible not to. I had paid the emotional and financial costs so consistently that the system felt invisible until I stepped away. Change didn't come quickly, but it came. My parents called now without needing anything. They asked about my work because they were curious, not because it might be useful. They remembered my birthday. Invitations arrived with intention. Marcus and I remained cautious. We met once a month, awkward, careful conversations where we learned how to speak as people instead of roles. He never offered a dramatic apology for the wedding. He didn't need to. His behavior carried what words would have cheapened. The bill was paid in full by October. I signed off on the final payment and closed the file. A chapter ended not with satisfaction, but with clarity. Thanksgiving came quietly. For the first time in years, I sat at the family table without tension tightening my chest, not because I had endured enough, but because I had stopped negotiating my worth. My mother asked about expansion plans. My father asked about travel. Jessica mentioned booking one of my venues for a friend. The conversation was unremarkable, and that was the point. After dinner, I stepped onto the porch alone. The night was sharp and still. Stars stretched overhead, indifferent and steady. I thought about the woman I had been a year earlier, The one who gave without asking, smoothed every conflict, mistook silence for peace. She wasn't gone. She had changed. The door opened behind me. Marcus stepped out with 2 cups of coffee, handing one over without comment. We stood there quietly. "I'm sorry," he said at last. "About the wedding, about the text, about all of it." "I know. Does knowing help a little?" He nodded. "I don't expect us to be close the way people expect siblings to be, but I'd like to be someone you don't have to protect yourself from." I looked at him not as the golden child, not as the weight I had carried for years, but as someone learning to stand on his own. "I'd like that too," I said. We went back inside together. There was no perfect ending. Old habits still surfaced. Some wounds still ached when touched. Repair moved slower than damage, but I was no longer doing the work alone, and that was what I kept. I stopped being invisible.